All right, please warm welcome back for David Hubbard.
Thanks very much, Erica. And first, let me express sincere thanks to Alex and Erica and their whole team for bringing us back together like this. You know, this is our annual opportunity to listen to tales that carry us away from the world's troubles, particularly at this time, and takes us to places that are real. And I'm sure we all appreciate that. I'm going to wander off the path a little bit today. That is, I'm not going to be focused strictly on travel by canoe or kayak through what we call wilderness. I'm going to divert from that path. So I went north in the 1970s as a canoeist, like so many here, in search of greater adventure in deeper wilderness. And not unlike the story that we're going to hear from Jim Boone this afternoon, 96-year-old Jim Boone, who did the same thing in 1969. We'll look forward to that. At the time, I was completely naive about the place. Oh, what happened there? I'm getting way ahead of myself. There we are. About the place of Inuit in this mosaic of the north. And it stayed that way for my first several years up north until a subsequent canoe trip landed me in Baker Lake, which is home to a remarkable, and at that time, an even more remarkable population of Inuit elders. People who had come off the land in the years prior to my arrival. One of those was Janet Kaguzio. This is her. She's similar to so many elders of her generation that I had the privilege to interview, to know quite well in many cases, in the 1980s and 90s. And like many others, she spoke of her childhood, where her family lived, how her mother taught her, what it was like when her father went out hunting for a day or two or three, and the joy when he came home with food. The stories from the elders were often much the same, but then they're not. Because hidden in the ordinary sounding story is the extraordinary. In interviews in the early 1980s, both Qajaq and her mother, a very famous artist, the most famous artist from Baker Lake, Jessie Unok, they both recounted the same story. No doubt Qajaq had learned it from her mother. I'm just going to paraphrase that story. I'm not going to quote it at length. She said, words to the effect, "Some years ago there was a powerful shaman who lived near Canoe. He was asked by the people in his camp to check on their relatives who lived up near the mouth of the Back River at a place called Itimnayo. Always such connection, such desire to make the connection was about the abundance of food. So he flew up to visit them and came back the same night," said Qajaq. She said this without drama, as if she were describing a day of fishing or playing with a toy doll that her father had made for her. And to us, of course, it might seem an extraordinary tale. But it's not fanciful or mysterious or unrealistic to Qajaq or anyone else of her generation. The point here is that when we consider the stories from the old Inuit, whom we think of now as the ancestors, we must step away from our personal frame of reference. But is it really all that different? Lots of people whom we all know believe in quite remarkable stories of creation, or resurrections, or miraculous accounts of impossible cures from intractable illness. So what's the difference, really, with our stories and Qajaq's story? Take the creation story. Inuit traditionally believed there was only water. And then the world, as we know it now, was created when rocks came down from the sky to create land, and then animals, including humans, emerged from the land. And they could transform in body from one form to another, which led to universal language, which they all spoke. Sounds pretty reasonable to me. You see where I'm going with this? I'll leave it to you to compare that with some of the stories of creation from our own cultures. But some may still find the idea of a shaman flying a couple of 100 miles from Baker Lake up to the Back River maybe a bit fanciful. Okay, if we want to discuss fantasy, please consider this. Cardinal Wolsey, as Lord Chancellor, the second most powerful man in the court of King Henry VIII in 16th century England. We'll get to him in a minute. He wore a large turquoise ring. It's in the Tower of London. This is true. And everyone at the time believed that Cardinal Wolsey, when he was wearing this ring, could fly. Furthermore, the ring could detect poison, render ferocious beasts harmless, protect against drowning, and vanquish the enemy. Useful powers. You could have them, and it was widely believed. And at the same period, in the mid-1500s, Christians all across Europe believed that every year, for the 12 days following Christmas, God permitted the dead to walk. Now, all that sounds a bit like fantasy to me. And that, for many of us, is a tale from the roots of our cultures. So, on the other hand, we have Qajaq's description of the shaman's flight up the Back River. It was not pure fantasy. This was a story about an old man, an elder, a very wise and respected elder, drawing on the generations of wisdom that had been gathered and preserved by the ancestors. A process that the shaman here had been trained for from a very young age as he became a shaman. So I say, if you want fantasy, look for it in a turquoise ring, not here. Now, just for a minute, for fun, let's compare these two men. Gentlemen, for sure. The shaman and the cardinal. You can probably tell which is which. At first glance, which one would you judge to be more given to the purely fanciful or the utterly fantastic? The guy on your left looks rather like a pragmatist to me. Pragmatist. Oh, sorry. How does it do that? I didn't. Okay, that's the guy on your left. Okay, he's the pragmatist in the pair, I'd say. So I hope you're with me so far. But if it's not fantasy to fly up to the Back River, then what is it? Let's get rid of Wolsey. For Qajaq to describe the shaman's journey is no more fantastic to her than to speak of her father going out hunting. Just as all the elders that I interviewed across the Arctic in the span from 25 to 40 years ago, Qajaq knew with absolute conviction that her parents and their ancestors had a wisdom and a depth of understanding for the land and the natural world that superseded all contemporary knowledge. It was unquestioned. So consider the shaman. He must have been a man who knew all the old stories. That is, he had abundant knowledge of the traditional ways and of travels in the region, including up to Itadayuk, at the mouth, near the mouth of the Back River. He knew that that was the place where the fish ran so thick that your qajaq would strike one with every thrust. He knew about the massive herds of caribou at that time that gathered there in late summer for the migration south. In other words, he knew absolutely where to find food because he embodied Inuit kilometres, the traditional knowledge. So if his people were hungry, would it not be natural for his mind to turn toward that place? And for sure, his knowledge included the storyline, which defined the route from here to there. More about storylines in a while. It was easy for him to take flight, metaphorically speaking. Qajaq was aware that the shaman who flew up to the Back River held knowledge of the ancestors. A knowledge that came down through the ages that Inuit carried with them from generation to generation. This knowledge is rooted in the land, just as the livelihood of all Inuit in before the 20th century was entirely dependent upon their connection to the land. That's why Inuit believed that all life forms were interconnected and interwoven and interchangeable. A long time ago, Inuit elders will still tell you when all the animals also spoke Inuktitut, there were many accounts of transformation from man to seal, or caribou, or fox, and vice versa. I think not. This notion is evident in both modern maps and the traditional methods of navigation. This is a map, take a look, of Hendingayuk. It's an area along the Back River. The map identifies all the old place names in an area of approximately 40,000 square kilometers. That's about 5.5 times the size of Algonquin Park, or if you like, 5.5 times the size of the GTA. Did you know Algonquin Park and the GTA are the same size? This map was a result of a project that I did in Baker Lake some years ago, and every one of those place names that you see there in Inuktitut are all ancient names that were passed down via the oral tradition through many generations. Each one tells a story, or at least hints at a story. Some of the stories are very short, some are extraordinarily long. All survive thanks to the power of the oral history and of the land as a repository of the traditional knowledge. A lovely old woman named qajaq once told me a story that took 2 days, on and off, breaks for lunch. We slept a bit during the night. 2 days to tell a story. Her daughters, 3 of them, were gathered around with me as we listened, and none of the daughters, all of them roughly my age, plus or minus, knew the whole story. But qajaq remembered remarkable detail of the story. And when she finished it, she leaned over to me. She put her hand on my arm, and she looked me close, right into my eyes, and said very softly, in Inuktitut, "This is all true. I told you this with the same words that my grandmother used." That's powerful. So of course I believe her. And that's how the oral history was passed down over centuries. So back to the map. If I zoom into this small area where the red circle is, maybe you can see a little better detail. You will see number 58, ukalaludok. Literally that means spoken words. But the root of that word also flows into a sense of story as it's used today. Tulaluyuk is a special island in Qajaq, or as we would say, in Gary Lake on the Back River. A friend of mine in Baker Lake who grew up in this area and knows it like you know your own backyard, he told me about this special island. He's been there. And anyone here contemplating a canoe trip on the Back River, take note. My old friend told me that if you stop there in your canoe, the island will speak to you, to welcome you, and wish you well on your journey. It speaks in Inuit, by the way, so brush up. It is in fact the voice of a dead Inuit who was brutally murdered on that island more than 100 years ago. And when he was killed, he did not cry out. He's legendary. But to this day, he speaks kindly to all who visit, including my friend in Baker Lake. So do you need further proof that the ancestors and their wisdom reside in the land itself, when the land can speak to you? There are many, many more tales from the land like this. Now let me now invoke the powerful lessons of Inuit navigation. As canoeists, we look at the land through which we travel rather the same way as we look at a map of the area. I call it aerial thinking, no pun intended. We have a different perspective. But it's one we all love, of course. Whoops. In my most recent book, The Ancestors Are Happy, I spent many pages exploring the Inuit connection to the land in different ways. I'd like to read for you the opening of one particular chapter, which is sort of seminal for me. Quote, "Before the storm began, I did not really know Telluriallic at all well. It was my first winter trip out on the land. This is more than 40 years ago now. Telluriallic planned to check his trapline one last time before the season ended, and he invited me to join him. Traveling by snowmobile over the trackless tundra, an area I was familiar with only in summer when its lines are much softer, I marveled at Telluriallic's intuition. Time after time, he pulled up beside an insignificant hump in the snow and thrust his snow knife beneath the crust to exhume a steel foxtrap. For the first time, I was witnessing two amazing processes. An Inuit's ability to navigate great distances of seemingly featureless terrain, and the acute visual perception that enabled him to recognize a precise spot on the snow. These observations were still whirling around in my head 4 days later as we sat in this igloo, patiently waiting out the blizzard that had begun late on that first day." Close quote. Though this experience with Telluriallic led me to want to dig more deeply into the Inuit perspective on the land itself, physically, spiritually, and into the methods of traditional navigation. So I spent a lot of the subsequent years focused on that idea. All the lines of travel that weave across the tundra are like so many pieces of the narrative thread. The more time I spent traveling on the land with Inuit, the more I learned to look at it differently. And here I want to pause to recognize my first and most important teacher in the Arctic, Nanek. Starting more than 40 years ago. He's on the cover of my book, sort of faded a little bit into the landscape to create an effect. I traveled thousands of miles with old Nanek across the tundra, based out of Baker Lake. He taught me how to travel safely and comfortably at 40 below, how to build an igloo, and more important, where to build an igloo. That's the key. how to skin a caribou, and so on. Everything that I needed to know in order to survive in that land. He came to calling me qajaq, meaning adopted son. I'm forever grateful to Manic. Back in the early 1990s, some Inuit friends in Haven, the next community in the archipelago to the east of Cambridge Bay, where I lived for many years, invited me to join them on what turned out to be an epic journey by dog team. They wanted to follow the traditional travel route of their ancestors, something none of them had ever done before, from their home in Haven to their relatives' village, which at that time was called Pelly Bay. Still, it's now qajaq. The whole story of this trip, of course, is included in my recent book, along with the lessons from it. And I'm not going to read that from you, of course, but just in short, the distance that we traveled as the raven flies from one village to the next across the frozen sea and the tundra was about 220 kilometers. But of course, one doesn't travel in straight lines on a journey like this, and nor is it measured in kilometers. The men, my friends, were more likely to talk about the number of days of travel that it would take, or the number of sleeps, if you like. They estimated 12 days, not counting any bad weather that might disrupt travel plans. But they were unconcerned about how many days it would take. It didn't matter to them. The sleds were packed with lots of survival gear and food for about 2 or 3 days. The rest we would catch along the way. They were confident. There's no worry there. The evening before we left Haven, our leader, a middle-aged man by the name of Ukpik, told me that he was going to see his father-in-law to get advice on the route. And he invited me to come along. For 3 hours, we sat and listened to this old man telling stories. There was no map on the table. He described the journey, which he had done several times as a younger man, by recounting things that had happened to him and to others along the route, and the remarkable features of the landscape around where incidents happened, using all of the old Inuit place names that in themselves carry meaning about the land. It was, in effect, a very long but fascinating and entirely memorable story that he told. And being memorable is the key to navigation. As the journey unfolded, Ukpik occasionally recalled and shared bits of the story that his father-in-law had told. We hunted and fished along the way to get food for ourselves and the dogs, and we had a marvelous time. Of course, I'll never forget it. I've done a fair bit of travel by dog team with Inuit friends, but this trip was definitely the best of the bunch. Crossing the sea ice is one thing. It's almost straight line travel. And it's another story how you do that without the use of a compass, basically by using the wind-blown ridges in the snow as your guide for direction. Contrary to popular opinion down south, there are not Inuksuks, more properly Inuksut, all along the way, marking the highway. And then our route left the sea and climbed up into the hills of the Boothia Peninsula. It was a maze of long, finger-like lakes, sinuous hills and valleys, rock outcroppings and towering cliffs. Magnificent landscape, but utterly confused, and not an Inuksuk to be seen. Notably, the stories of the landscape became vital to our travel. Ukpik led us on, ever confident that he was following his father-in-law's directions, that is, following the storyline through the landscape. At one point, he directed the dog teams up a very long slope so we could reach a high point and view the land all around. He wasn't lost, exactly, but he felt like he'd abandoned the intended route. He was off the storyline. From the high point, we could see 3,000 or 4,000 square kilometers, empty tundra all around, which in itself is an awe-inspiring experience. I asked Ukpik if he'd like to take a look at the topo maps that I had in my knapsack. He dismissed me and my maps, on the other hand. It's not that he could not read maps. All of these men were very comfortable with maps. But in this circumstance, they were clearly an unnecessary intrusion from his perspective. That night, we camped exactly where he had intended to camp, in accordance with the father-in-law's story. In other words, Upik regained the storyline so our journey could continue as foreseen. In this sense, the whole trip unfolded exactly as planned. And along the way, we retreated to a remarkable series of stories from the old days, when many people traveled this route by dog team. And by the way, we arrived in Pelly Bay right on time, whatever that means. Just a final word of acknowledgement, if I may. First, again, sincere thanks to Alex and his team for the invitation to be here today, and to all of you for your attention. I'm grateful to Crossfield Publishing for being here today to make my most recent book available for you. And along with a few remaining copies of my Theon book, which some of you know of, and probably some of you have, which was published nearly 30 years ago. It's had a good run, but it's about to go out of print. All of this is out at the table out in the central area there. And there's also on the table some very beautiful catalogs from Adventure Canada. They're free for the taking. I urge you to do so, if only for the pictures, but some of you may be getting to the point in life where you think an Adventure Canada trip might be an easier way to go to the north. My thanks indeed to AC for their support today and always. And finally, I want to draw your attention to the ILIC Fund. I'm not going to go on at length about it. I think some of you know, but there is a one-pager on the book table that you're welcome to take. To learn more about it, please check it out if you can. It's our effort to support Inuit youth, in particular participating in the sort of adventures that we all cherish. Thanks so much.